I am so glad you clicked on this video because taking the opportunity to practice these skills that we're talking about with me is the best way to learn them so that you can successfully complete your assignments. So let's practice how we would use Venn diagrams to test arguments for validity from both the Boolean and the Aristotelian standpoints. So here's our argument. Worms are not tasty food. Therefore, the worms I'm eating are not tasty. It's pretty gross. Okay, so we see here we've got an argument that is not expressed in standard form categorical statements. So the very first thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to identify the premise statement and the conclusion statement and then translate both of those statements into standard form. Once you've done that, you get to symbolically represent this argument, and you want to make sure that you are very clearly indicating what each of the letters you've chosen to represent your subject and predicate terms, what terms those letters are standing in place for. Then we're going to mark the premise in our Venn diagram, and we're going to take a step back and we're going to look at it to see if it now reflects also the conclusion statement. Because if it does, that tells us the argument is unconditionally valid. In other words, it's valid from the Boolean standpoint, and it's valid from the Aristotelian standpoint, because any argument valid from the Boolean standpoint is also valid from the Aristotelian standpoint. But if we look at that Venn diagram and we do not see the conclusion statement after we've marked only the premise, we got to change our perspective. We got to adopt the Aristotelian standpoint. And once we do that, we're going to look really carefully at our subject term circle, and we're going to look to see if there's only one area left of that subject circle that is the only area unshaded. Because if there is such an area, we're going to mark that circled X in it. And once we mark that circled X there, we're going to now look to see, do I now see the conclusion? Because if I do, that tells me this argument is conditionally valid. And so then from the Aristotelian standpoint, and then the next question I have to ask is, well, does the subject term exist? If so, the argument's conditionally valid from the Aristotelian, or it's valid from the Aristotelian standpoint because the condition's been met. But if it's not, if the subject term is not referring to something that actually exists, then the argument is invalid from both the Aristotelian and the Boolean standpoint. Okay, so why don't you go ahead and pause your video, complete these 8 steps, and then when you're ready to check your work, restart your video. All right, let's see what you got going on here. Okay, so the first thing I notice is we've got a conclusion indicator. That tells me that the sentence that follows that is the conclusion statement. The worms I'm eating are not tasty. So now that I've got my premise and conclusion statement identified, I need to translate them into standard form. I translated them this way. You may have something slightly different. No worms are tasty foods. Therefore, some worms are not tasty foods. Okay? We're going to represent this symbolically. I chose W and T to represent worms and tasty foods. You may have different letters. That's okay. You just want to make sure that you have an argument form that has an E statement as the premise and an O statement as the conclusion. And you also want to make sure that you look at your predicate term that you have here and make sure it's a countable plural noun or noun phrase. All right, so now that we've got our argument represented symbolically, we can go ahead and Venn diagram it. And to do that, we're going to shade in area 2 to show that no WRT. There's nothing here. And when we do that, we get a Venn diagram that looks like this. So now we step back and we ask ourselves, do I see the conclusion statement some W are not T? And the answer is no. Because for the diagram to show some W are not T, there would have to be an X here in area 1, and I don't see any such X. That tells us this argument is invalid from the Boolean standpoint. And again, we can look at its form. Universal premise, particular conclusion, that's always an existential fallacy from the Boolean standpoint. But I now get to put on my Aristotelian goggles, and I get to look at this Venn diagram from the Aristotelian standpoint, and that means I look at my W circle and I ask myself, is there any area of the W circle that's the only area left unshaded? And the answer is yeah, area 1. All the W's that exist have been pushed here into area 1 when we shaded area 2. And that means that if they're all there, whoops, there's at least one there. And I get to put my circled X, and that means, okay, I see the conclusion. This argument is conditionally valid from the Aristotelian standpoint, but the condition that has to be met is that worms have to exist. And they do. And that tells me that this argument is valid from the Aristotelian standpoint.